Waking Up is Not Enough. Flourishing in the Human Space, a podcast by Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger. When you peek into the cosmic unity of existence and feel the love and inspiration of awakening, what happens next? Whether it's through meditation, spiritual practice, near-death experience, ingesting a mind-altering substance, or being born again, you don't get a map for improving your messy life. In this podcast, Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger draw on expertise in science, psychology, adult development, psychedelics, NDEs, dreams, and Buddhist practice in conversations about compassion, resilience, responsibility, kindness, and development after awakening. You will learn how to chart a new path for flourishing in the human space, in which waking up is important, but not enough, and growing up is never finished. Co-hosts Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger bring different kinds of expertise. Polly is an author, psychologist, Jungian analyst, longtime Zen practitioner, couple therapist, and founder of Dialogue Therapy and Real Dialogue. Michael Berger is an entrepreneur, an expert in psychedelics, a spiritual practitioner of Jewishness, a skeptic, a Real Dialogue specialist, and a filmmaker who is known for his documentary, Improbable Collapse, The Demolition of Our Republic. Polly and Mike will engage with each other and invite a wide array of guests who are accomplished scientists and seekers whose work lies beyond the hegemony of materialism.
Bayo Akomalafe is an author, celebrated speaker, teacher, psychologist, and self-styled trans-public intellectual whose vocation goes beyond justice and speaking truth to power to opening up other spaces of power with and queering our fond formulations and expectations of hope. Bayo was born in 1983 into a Christian home and to Yoruba parents in Western Nigeria. Soon after he was born, his family immigrated to Bonn, Germany, with his father on his first diplomatic assignment. This, Bayo's first trip, would foreshadow a life of travel to come. Losing his diplomat father to a sudden heart attack in Zaire, Bayo became a reclusive teenager seeking to get to the heart of the matter as a response to his painful loss. Bayo has been visiting professor at Middlebury College, has taught at Sonoma State University, Simon Fraser University, and Schumacher College, among other universities around the world. He currently lectures at Pacifica Graduate Institute and the University of Vermont. He sits on the board of many organizations, including Science and Non-Duality. In this conversation, Bayo and Mike and Polly talk about the colonizing and decolonizing of our minds. Together, we are looking for a way to live with a non-fixed identity and yet a deep sense of belonging. In this wide-ranging, extraordinary conversation, Bayo, Polly, and Mike discover new ways of thinking about body, life and death, and belonging, finding a piece in the identity puzzle that truly breaks through the harmful statement, I am this.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here with you, Bayo, and with Mike. We start often with a question about awakening. And so I wonder how you define or describe this idea of awakening or even enlightenment, what we awaken from, what we awaken to, or any way you want to speak about it.
For some reason, escapes immediate analysis. I've had my mind flooded with images of this tribe in this particular ritual with a tribe in Kenya, where the rite of passage involving a boy transiting to a man involves going to kill a lion. You go out, Sometimes you go to a crew, you kill the lion and you bring back its meat and its skin and its hair, and that is divided into different parts of nourishment for the city. It becomes clothes, it becomes food, and all of that. But I'm just dwelling with the imagery of entering manhood, right? Of becoming different, and how the village swirls around this newly birthed human or man, and how they welcome this body into a new territory of relations and economics and spiritualities and practices. And maybe that's how I want to premise or think about awakening, right? As some kind of sensorial hospitality to new and different territories of becoming, right? So when people popularly speak about awakening, I think there is the presupposition of already extant and pre-relational dimensions of being, right? We're awakening to a new reality is, as if this is the old and that is the new. It's kind of machinic in the way that it's articulated. But I like to think about the world as sensorially indeterminate. It's an ecology of moving territories and moral orders and ethical fields and intensities. So that awakening is how eruption happens, how we are, some kind of sensorial mutiny happens, and we are enlisted in other fields of becoming. So maybe this is how I want to think about awakening, as coming alive to other senses.
It seems that that strikes me as a little bit like a crisis also. It's a disruption of what has been seeming to be stable
Yes,
or continuous into something that is different suddenly, in
yes,
the sense of in this initiation, it's being, let's say, guided, or there's someone who's mentoring it or something like that,
mhm,
perhaps,
mhm,
and well, it strikes me also because I do think about this and have talked about it, about the first time that I gave birth, and the baby was 10 pounds, no medications, childbirth. I was Zen practitioner, and so I'm going through 14 hours, and at some point I see this white light at the end of this tunnel, and I really thought, am I the baby getting born, or am I dying here? It looks like I'm dying because I'm going towards this dark tunnel into this white light, and it was a crisis. And then I'm not entirely sure. I mean, by the report, I grabbed the doctor or something, I don't know. But the doctor then did a forceps delivery, and that was my daughter. That was a huge, huge transition, and I'm still integrating the experience that I had there. So, it
mhm.
strikes me that your way of looking at this is also does fit a certain kind of crisis that,
It's like a teasing apart of the materials that keep senses, which are, I don't want to allocate senses to stable properties of bodies. I want to think of senses as fields, intensities. So the materials that keep them stable are temporarily weakened or exhausted. And maybe that's what a crisis is in some way as well, that we are constantly navigating things that language has no space for. And what we rudely call an awakening is an invitation, or there's a new word that I think it's not available in English, but it's, if it were to be in anglicized, it would be called convitation.
hmm,
And a convitation, like an invitation, presupposes a host and a hosted, right? The guest and the host. But a convitation is a mutual estrangement of the twain, right? So I've been using convitation to signal the ways that we are becoming stranger. And this is what a crisis is a becoming stranger.
So, would you also include in that a dissolution of what we consider ordinary boundaries? It's a shifting of identity and boundary to become more expansive and to dissolve the sense of isolated individuality.
Yes,
It
yes,
implies the interconnectedness with the wider world, the wider community, like as in the rite of passage, you emerge from it with a new identity.
yes, yes. It's that, the individual is a choreography of practices. It's not that there are isolated individuals that live in a relational world. I think that's a convenient way of speaking about it, but it doesn't really track with the deeper insights of processual thinking, of relational thinking, of ecological material feminisms, of Whiteheadian thought, right? Bergsonian thought, the idea that the individual is a performance, right? And boundaries are practices as well. Even identity is not as stationary as we think it is. In a manner of speaking, we don't have identities. Identities enlist us temporarily in how our bodies come to matter.
And when we wake in the morning, the sense of identity is altogether different than it is for me even now, some hours after I've awakened and what I awakened to, many times, and I want to move towards identity, but many times people have the sense of the body being the place that they are located, as though they're sort of, I know that in fact, this is the way perception gets organized within a group and so on, like I'm inside of my body and the world is out there. And if I didn't have that ability to organize in that way, I'd be in trouble and in deep trouble. So the fact that we do organize that is good. But then
Yeah.
then there's this identification with the body.
Yeah.
This is me. I wonder, if you could talk a little bit about how this kind of awakening that you're talking about, this awakening to, what did you call it? Not invitation, but no,
Convitation.
convitation. That kind of awakening, how would you say the body or identity is affected or transformed or, whatever the word would be?
Mhm. Well, just to take a few steps back, with your thought around co-creation, I think I understand that noticing of the tension of using a word that might suggest already predetermined entities, relating with each other or co-creating something. So I use entrainment a lot, and I like the chemistry of it. It's almost like fluids mixing, and there isn't a parsing of fluid or fluidity. It's just how things are entrained, how they accompany each other in an imminent process of co-becoming. I haven't finished reading. I just started to read an essay about the phantom limb and and some new implications arising from that. So I don't know how to speak about the newer implications because I'm still digesting this essay, but something that simmered and flashed to the surface was how when we wake up every morning, we perform embodiment. This is what Professor Erin Manning would call autistic perception. So normative perception or normative accounts of perception would presume that we are merely representing the world as it is, right? From a stable viewer to the stable viewed, right? So we wake up, there's the world, there's the window, there's a cup of tea, and there is the person looking out through the prisms of our eyes to digest and represent all these things. But what these persons or cognitive scientists are noticing, which is what Erin Manning and a slew of other post-humanist scholars have already understood, is that it doesn't quite work that way. It's like the world is constantly being made, right? We don't wake up to a world that is there. We literally fit into our limbs. It's like we take on a suit and we wear a suit. It's just it almost infinitesimally thin space of time, of space-time, where we are confused about where we are. And I've had this experience many times because I travel a lot. I'm in a hotel room and I wake up and I literally put the pieces back together. Okay, I'm somewhere in Paris and I'm here to do a talk, right? It's like putting the pieces back together again and then a picture emerges. I think we're constantly in the practice. It's just somewhere in the subconscious of remaking ourselves in relation to the world. And there goes identity. Identity is such a charged topic, especially in racialized spaces and times. We want to speak about it as if it's the starting point of the conversation, but there is this urge to draw the constraints back and see how identity might also become a carceral dynamic. might also stabilize us within the very dynamics we're trying to contest. For instance, in the United States, identity shows up as the site of contestation, right? The grounds upon which I stand to make claims to the nation state, to pay attention to me. But framing identity that way also implies that I'm borrowing from the resources, the epistemological, civilizational resources of my captivity to make claims for my freedom. There, the irony and the cycle spins endlessly.
It's like the colonizing of our experience rather than the experiencing of the colonizing is the way I would think of it. And you make so many important points. This sort of autistic embodiment, well, there's a term that comes from some of Melanie Klein's, the extension of her theory called the autistic contiguous position of the mind. And this is Tom Ogden's work principally, which is an organization of the mind that occurs all the time. It's like we need to get a feel for I'm in here or we're not. And then of course the next organization would be what they call the paranoid schizoid, which is that you have this sense that you're isolated and it makes you paranoid, and so you're organizing things by that. And then the final organization is called the depressive position, whereby they mean, the theorists mean, that you recognize that you're not really here in the way that you think you're here. You're here with others and you're going to lose them. And so you need to recognize how particular and important they are with this sense of loss already impending. I mean, that's why they call it the depressive position, because you recognize that you're here briefly and with others and they are special. So I was thinking of that as a map that's somewhat on the same theme. And then, I want to bring Mike in because he is kind of I consider him an expert on psychedelics, and I'm not. And that's one reason why I have Mike talking to me often, so he can talk about the psychedelic renaissance and so on. So I was wondering, Mike, how you were, experiencing what Bayo was saying about embodiment.
Well, Bayo has used the word entrainment, entanglement. I think the word you may have been looking for before might have been interstitial. It's that space between when you wake up.
The liminality of space, it captures that a little bit. Yeah.
And in the past, I've heard you discuss identity in terms of, or in relationship to an entanglement. So in one sense, one of the areas I'm interested in is how the map or model of reality that we create at times makes it appear that I'm in here and you're out there.
Yep.
So to me, that's an entrainment. Each day, that's reinforced over and over again. It's only an experience that breaks us out of that. I would call it a trance, right? We've been entrained into this trance. We're all walking in a somewhat shared trance state. And it's the people who break out and begin to speak about it at first who are minimized, because it's actually a threat to that entrained state and sense of identity that seems to be at the center of how we, are pitted against each other with certain untested belief systems. So, for example, that we're all competing for very limited resources. That's a belief system from a certain perspective and a way of looking at the world out there. I dominate the world out there. I can extract resources, but in no way is there a connection between me and the depletion of those resources, or a broader awareness of how I'm a functional part of a planetary awareness that seems to be burgeoning. I don't know if that's something that could lead into the discussion maybe around identity, because you do have a very different perspective, I think, than what most people would assume identity is.
It might be, and I remember the word, by the way, it's called infrathin. So INFRA thin, THIN. And I cannot remember the person who spoke about it first, but it's this space of autistic liminality, but I digress. Yeah, I was just in the conversation before jumping on board this one about double slit, the double
Mm.
slit apparatus and the identity of the wave and the particle,
Look,
like particulate matter, shows up as a wave depending on the apparatus of measurement, right? And if you tweak the apparatus in some way, it shows up as a particle. If you tweak it another way, whatever is being measured shows up as a wave, so that the identity isn't of the thing being measured, it is of the arrangement, right? Identity is secreted by arrangements and measured within assemblages. Does that make sense, Michael? I can see
oh,
you.
yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's funny in my notes in the preparation, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, are you familiar with E prime? David Borland, who was a student of Alfred Korzybski, created a version of English without the verb to be. And one of the examples I have down is the electron is a particle. This would be how we would normally say it.
Yeah,
But if you change the way you language it, one could say the electron functions as a particle when measured with the first instrument.
right,
The
right.
electron is a wave, or the electron functions as a wave when measured with the other instrument.
Mm,
So
mm,
the ultimate instrument is our awareness, our consciousness. That's what measures whatever's happening. So in previous conversations, like with Donald Hoffman, the frontiers now in quantum physics demonstrate that the measurement device is not separate from the thing being measured, and the thing being measured doesn't have an inherent essence or property. There's a co-relationship involved, or which is why I brought in the word entanglement. These
yeah,
things are not separate from each other. And
yes.
yet, because of our sense of being in the center of our senses and how we come into being and differentiating a self, it's as if we're missing another rite of passage where we go from being an individual that requires that sense of self to function to then becoming a higher functional unit of a much larger system, in the same way that cells in our body self-organize and become organs that maintain our health. To me, I see the various types of awareness and beings on the planet as these functional units of giving birth to a planetary sense of identity,
Mm,
which then at one time might become a larger, one cell in a much larger vision as we
mm,
grow into inhabiting that newer identity or larger identity.
mm. Well, yeah, that feels very interesting to explore, this E prime that almost intervenes in the nounism, right?
Yes.
The Dare I call it the nounization of of language, where things are, arranged as beings and entities, and there's no activity there. They're just there, right? So the idea of particulate matter taking on a different identity depending on the assemblage, I think finds resonance in the things we're talking about here about identity. However, I would suggest that, what you say about entrainment and bodies and habituation, and then your aspiration for a planetary, that it's not dependent on consciousness, insofar as we start to think of consciousness as what human beings have, right? Because I think of consciousness as much more than human. So I would think along with James Hillman in terms of the anima mundi, and that it's not us create, it's not humans creating reality. Is that to speak about the world in its utter incalculability and its creativity is to enlist the post-human, the more than human, how materials, textures, intensities, trauma, architecture, and all these kinds of entrainments create. They're the assemblage. We are part of the assemblage, right? So we are not the objects of entrainment, as if reality surrounds us. It is that we are the traffic. We're not in traffic, we are traffic, right? And this is how bodies are entrained and they become different. Yeah.
Well, I think it's difficult to even, let's say, imagine, to evoke Jim Hillman and the imaginal, or the imaginary, that we participate somehow in creating what we
Yeah.
call, reality, or the thing that we are emerging within. We're participating in it. And it always strikes me when we get into talking about the slit experiments and entanglement theory and so on, it always strikes me that these are people talking to each other about these things.
Yes,
These are
yes,
not things, these are conversations.
yes.
And if you don't keep on remembering that, you begin to believe that there are things out there like, let's say, slit experiments, where you are either going to see this energy as a wave or a particle. No, these are conversations that people are having about their experiences. And then when they're scientists, they try to be precise and they try to use mathematics because, in fact, that constrains a conversation, perhaps keeps them more honest. Perhaps they have to then, be more disciplined. Perhaps, not always, but sometimes. This conversation about the experience that we find ourselves in is, changing right now. And that's one thing you participate in, is changing it. I'm especially interested in the issue of embodiment and how we participate because I've had enough near-death experiences, not extensive, not elaborate, I'm not Eben Alexander or whatever, but I've had enough to recognize that whatever it is that is what I would call my awareness is popping out of what I call my body. And this awareness now can some perceive the body, or in one experience I had, which was in a dream, but it was a dream after I'd had an extreme surgery. And so I left the body from the top of the head, this body, and I was somewhere observing what I said was, oh, that's what they call a life. And it was a piece of tissue paper that had a photograph on it that seemed like an old Polaroid photograph. And it was floating in space and kind of moving on. It was going to disintegrate. And that was a kind of insight that I recognized that affected me very much, that what we call my life is so not something, and then people get very involved in, I need to protect my health, my life. And of course, I'm not recommending by any means, not living in the conventional world, but just that holding it lightly, this conversation that we're having, may allow people I'm hoping so much to recognize that our identities are not separate, that you and I and Michael talking to each other, we are participating all at once and all together here. We have no idea of what is really going on, but we're developing something, our awareness, our ability to talk about these things in the same way the physicists and Don Hoffman and the cognitive scientists are developing through studying phantom lens, near-death experience, whatever. This issue of, being embodied in an environment that we don't understand, that we're trying to understand. But, from my point of view, could we do that now? Can we possibly do it without killing large numbers of people? Like, could we stop that? Could we stop the war thing? Because it looks so absurd from this new point of view. It's not even the sort of more immorality or whatever, but just the ridiculous grotesqueness of it. So, there's something about the way that we've talked about each other, thought about each other over time that leads us as humans to want to kill even strangers, and so to me, this is an important and very immediate, along with the issues of identity politics, very pressing issue for talking about what we're talking about, embodiment, the way we talk to each other about our existence, and the changing ways now that are emerging, that might support something different. So I know I've kind of gone from one sort of thing to the other, but
Beautiful.
I'm anywhere you want to come in on that, on the way that you think about, sort of who we are or how we think.
Well, one way we speak about who we are is through some kind of a solar teleology, right? A teleological description of who we are that positions us on a linearity of discovery. And so we problematize the worlds we're in right now by saying, hey, we've lost a sense of who we really are. An articulation that I find suspect, and not exactly very interesting to me, because it leads to a dead end, as if identity were something to get back to. right? Let's go back to who we really are. And then everything else becomes the subject of appearances and illusions. Then it creates an ethical divide again between reality as noumenon and the phenomenon. And I would rather situate those questions within these open-ended explorations. And I would, I feel quite in my elements to speak about consciousness and identity and the questions about life, the beautiful nuanced articulations you just offered now, Polly, within the theoretical framework of abjection. I'm thinking about it as abjection. And maybe I could concretize it this way with an example. I gave this recently to a group in Italy. Imagine, and I don't know which of you does puzzles. You do. You like puzzles and you put puzzles together. Polly, yes?
A little.
Okay.
My grandson is totally into this Legos and so on, and I can enjoy that with him. But my son and my grandson and the men in my family are engineers.
Puzzle.
Yeah, they're headed towards engineer, medicine, that type of thing. But yeah,
putting things together. Yeah. I know lots of people that like to put giant 10,000 piece puzzles together. I give an example. This is just to think along with. Imagine that you got this puzzle, you got down to it, and you spent hours upon hours on end to finish it. And you, in fact, finish it. You put everything together. It's a nice rectangle. There's nothing missing between. And it's a picture of a cat, as you expected it to be, right there on the image, on the box. Except that you look to the side and you find a missing piece. Except that this piece doesn't fit because there's no gap for it to fit into. And there's nothing on the edges that would invite it to find its space there. So it's not missing after all, but it's there. It's not even an extra piece because this piece behaves differently. It's shaped in a way as if to suggest it's not part of the framework at all. And yet it came with the box. And so you call the manufacturer because you're really bothered by this. And you say, can I speak to the manager? And the manager says, I don't have time for this. Did you get your puzzle? Please have your puzzle. And whatever disturbs you, discard. But you're not able to do that. You just hold this exilic, embarrassing, excessive piece, and you don't know what to do with it. It then becomes an object of fascination. You put it in an altar and you try to write about it. You try to give attention to it. Some others might throw it away and be done with it, but then this piece becomes this shimmering spot of affection. I think of life in that way, that a lot of our theories on consciousness, for instance, try to reduce it to the complete picture. But there are ways we can speak about the complete picture that doesn't even refer or need the extra that is consciousness, right? So consciousness, life, the positionality of identity is some kind of abjection. It's outside of our frameworks of making and creating, and yet it is intimately present in all we do. It is right there alongside us. Maybe I'll stop at that and leave that as an intriguing prospect for thinking about these very nuanced things.
I see there's a parallel between the phantom limb.
The phantom limb, yes.
And so I don't know how far along you are in that, but are you aware of like soldiers, for example, who lose a limb in war? They still feel it, and they have this urge. But are you aware of how they're able to fulfill that urge? Have you? I don't know if you've gotten to that point yet of how you appease the phantom limb.
Yes. I mean, some of these scientists say that the brain creates these illusions and they boil it down to neural pathways that are still fired when the phantom limb is activated, if you will. And they feel it. Like if in those classical depictions of the experiment, the fake hand is on this side and the real hand, but the fake hand looks exactly like the real hand. And so when they do anything here, like bring out a hammer, hit the fake hand, which brings up other questions that are very interesting about, is that a form of harm, for instance? But let's not go there. The hand that is hidden feels the same thing, right? As the way they explain it is that the brain is activated in those spaces. I don't think it's as easy as that. I think they start from the idea that identity and self and the brain are stable units, right? and they extrapolate from there. What if we started from noticing that the self is already diffracted, right? This is what autistic perception is already in touch with. I'd like to tell people that my son is autistic, he's 6 years old. He could come into a room and notice patterns immediately, but he finds it difficult, infinitely difficult to tie his own shoelaces. I tell people that the reason he's unable to tie his shoelace is because for me, the distance between me and my shoelace is just a few feet, very few short feet. But for my son, to bend down, he has to traverse galaxies to get there. His head literally has to go through the Milky Way and go through other planetary formations just to get to his toes. And that is the idea here that I'm working with, the idea that we are already diffracted. The energy of society, the energy of modern arrangements is to create the stable, dissociated self that moves through space-time.
I think back to your term, using the term entrainment. We're entrained to experience ourselves in a very specific way. If we've never been entrained that way, we have an entirely different experience of reality.
Yes.
And I guess where I was going with the phantom limb in those experiments, if you put a mirror in front of the person who has the phantom limb so that they can see the phantom limb, they can actually scratch the phantom limb, which again gets back into how do you break that trance of entrainment, because it's invisible to us, just like the culture we're born into is invisible to us unless you go and experience a different culture or move away from where you are, which then breaks you out of the trance. You can then see the trance you were in if you question.
Yes. It's also a way of, interrogating the very, very limited sense of self that pervades our popular conversations about selfhood, right? It's where does the self begin and where does it stop, right? That's a beautiful consideration that comes out from those experiments as well.
So my husband died of early onset Alzheimer's, and that was back in 2014. In the process of his dying, and it was so it was a 10-year arc of his losing his sense of self, right? So it started in his mid-50s and it ended in his mid-60s when he died. I saw the dissolution of the organization that had been ED, and it gradually became more and more like a child and a toddler and then a baby. And he had all those characteristics of a 210-pound baby at the time that he was dying. He really couldn't move on his own. He had to be hoisted. He couldn't talk. He couldn't swallow at that point. That's the reason he was dying. But when he was actually dying, and so he was a Buddhist practitioner, Zen practitioner, not a very good one. He never really liked doing it, but he was surrounded by people who liked him, and many of them were there, and I was there, and his teacher, who was also my friend, a woman, was there when he was dying. And when he was actually dying for about, I would say, a half hour or more, he became completely conscious. He was laughing and smiling. And I had seen a brain study of his brain about 2 weeks before, because he had a torticollis. His neck was bent, and we thought perhaps his brain had no cortex. It was just a brainstem. In fact, the nurse hadn't wanted to show me the study because it looked so bad. But I mean, I had already been with Edel. I mean, I could tell that there was a problem here, and I wasn't surprised to see the way this brain looked. But what was so surprising is that he became completely conscious, laughing, interacting with me, no cortex, zero cortex. I had seen the study myself, and then died with his eyes entrained on mine and with light coming out of his eyes and the light going into me. And I could feel it. I could feel it was like almost like an energy. Honestly, the way I experienced it, it lasted a long time, the way he held my gaze. But in the back of my mind, sort of in my speech area of my brain, there was a narrative going on. And I could almost experience it right in the back of my head, saying, nobody ever told me about this. Why didn't somebody tell me about this? I didn't know that this could happen. I mean, this was the narrative that was going on while he was holding my gaze and he was dying. And all of these things were happening in a way that were shocking, like a crisis, and completely against anything that I knew. And I felt, even at that time, that he was teaching me something. that he was teaching me this whole sort of configuration of stuff. But one of the most surprising things was that he had become essentially himself again. That he was organized in this way that he hadn't been organized for, at least I would say at that point, he hadn't really been organized at all that way for 3 years. I mean, come and going before that. Certainly, this was a great teaching for me. Like your son is teaching you about his experience, and so I could, in just that period of time, which was probably roughly an hour. I mean, I had to rest afterwards, and then we bathed his body and did a lot of things with him. But that event, I saw so much. I saw consciousness is not dependent on the brain, because I saw that he had no cortex. I also saw he snapped back into being himself, and now he's gone. And so what is all of that? Also, he was happy. He was laughing, and we were chanting and singing, and I would say I love you in the chant, and he would just laugh. And so it was just all so interesting, because none of it fitted with anybody's narrative. And then also my own mind was trying to get to this. Why hasn't anyone told me about this?
Right.
I think paying attention to these states of mind that come to us also. People have nighttime dreaming. Many times they don't pay much attention, and at least in North America, this fluidity and this occupation of different ways of being is not very far away, really. I mean, most people could access it if they paid attention to their nighttime dreaming. I like very much the way you say, we colonize essentially our sense of self by taking the narrative of the colonizers, of the ones who are holding us capture. Then we use their narrative to talk to ourselves about ourselves. That has to go. That has to. I feel like that has to stop now. Could we stop this?
Let's just stop it.
I would like to. So I mean, I'm again. I feel like we're in a flow, and I hope someone picks up on some things.
I mean, there's a lot in there. I was thinking about for some reason, the brittle starfish. I think it's called a brittle starfish, and it has no central brain, and yet it is deeply intelligent in how it navigates and evades predator and maneuvers and all of that. It's maybe a number of things are articulable here. The idea that consciousness needs a self or brain is a bit flimsy at the moment and difficult to sustain given the things we're now examining. Maybe the idea that we come, born with stable identities is also, the jury's still out on that, it feels. But much more promising is this idea that death needs a new cosmology, I think. That the way it was Henry Bergson that spoke about things counterfeiting immobility, that the world is so processual and flowing, but our language, counterfeits immobility, as if we were latching onto stable things or with already predetermined qualities, predetermined identities, predetermined properties, all of that, and outlines. And I think the invitation to notice how death is just as intelligent as life, and identity is, even though it's a form of belonging, is already replete with departures, right? We would often pathologize those entry points, give it a name like psychosis or schizophrenia or autism, which was originally a form of schizophrenia, right? We will constantly name the cracks in order to preserve specific kinds of entrainments. But now it feels we need a politics that is sensitive to those departures.
And it requires a new language. In trying to practice speaking in E prime, it's quite challenging because, for one, I have to be a first-person subject, and I have to avoid speaking as if what I'm saying is truth. Using the identity of is, like from what I was hearing you say, I mean, this is forcing what I'm speaking about into a static isness, right? It has an essence. There's something to it that's stable over time.
Yeah.
But that's something I'm creating by languaging it in a static model.
Yeah.
My maps don't update. So much of the way I've been entrained to think about reality is still based on the thoughts of Aristotle when I use is, that I'm speaking of these indwelling invisible essences in people, in objects, when that may just be a function of the language I'm using to create the model. If I change how I speak about the model, I have a better chance or an opportunity to have a living model. And I think that's actually quite frightening, because I want to have some sense of security and safety and knowing I'm here and you're there. But I've been entrained to think that's how the world is.
Right. May I suggest, since there's a new movie on Superman coming out, just to, I know we're close to ending our conversation, but there is a beautiful cartoon on Superman that I love. It's called Superman All-Star. And 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 I think the story is about Superman dying. He's losing his powers slowly. And I'm sure you're familiar with the mythos of Superman, and the villain is Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor finds a way to extract Superman's powers into a fluid, and he injects himself with it. And so Lex Luthor, for a time, gains Superman's powers. And Superman, meanwhile, is losing his power, all his powers, because he flew to the sun and he ingested too much sunlight, I think. And so cracks are showing up all around him or on his body. So Lex Luthor basically takes over the world. He flies, he moves through space-time with a speed like Superman, and he captures the city at some point and announces his intention to occupy the White House, and says, by this evening, the United States is mine. And Superman is there on the floor. And journalists and the citizens are watching this super being announcing his godhood to everyone. And then for a moment, Lex Luthor goes silent, absolutely silent. And everyone is expecting him to speak, but it gets really awkward. And he's not saying anything. He just seems to be staring into, the space immediately before his eyes, and touching things, like he has the Apple Vision Pro on his head and he's touching things that are not. And then he starts to mutter to himself. So this is how he sees, right? And then the audience is brought into realizing that Lex Luthor is finally in touch with the way Superman sees the world, that there's no ontological separation between him and Superman or the others, that Superman is always in touch, quite autistically, with how entrainment is imminently happening, right down to quantum levels. And so he's actually immobilized by the power. That's the beautiful resolution of the film. He has so much power, but he finds there's no more enemy as a result of the power. In fact, the very notion of an enemy is a form of disability, or it's like there's something broken about the notion of an enemy, and that's how the movie ends, really. And maybe that's the spirit of what we've been talking about.
Absolutely. That's so beautiful. And
Yes.
this is available now?
Oh yes.
The Superman All-Star. Okay. Yes. No, I don't always keep up with what's available. So
I
that's
know.
it.
Oh, there's a lot of material, beautiful material there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it sounds absolutely wonderful. And it brings in a very sweet and very beautiful way the issue, I would say, of our relationship to what I'm going to call God. I mean, I don't know really what the best word you could say, the absolute. I don't really care about the word, but we participate, but we're not that thing. I mean, it's confusing, because if you don't realize that you participate in making this world, that somehow you're participating, but you're not making it. You're making it with something that is that you're participating in, but you are not that thing, but you sort of are that thing. And it sounds like the movie, in a way, is bringing these ideas out in a way that maybe even young people, children, and so on, can grasp without having a lot of philosophy or a lot of investigation of the ideas that all of us have spent a lot of time investigating in abstract ways. It sounds exactly what is really needing to happen. I mean, to recognize in a visceral way that you don't need an enemy. that even thinking or experiencing that you need an enemy is a problem for you.
Right.
It's a problem.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and that's sounds really wonderful. So I think that's a good place to close. I hope we can continue another time,
We
Bayo and
will
I.
continue, Polly. We always continue.
Yes, yes, of course, but I mean specifically and soon.
No,
Um,
I think that was a great way to end, to encapsulate on many levels this notion of entrainment, identity, fluidity, and in a way the interconnectedness of all things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was a beautiful story. Thank you.
so it's wonderful to be with you, Bayo. I hope someday I'm in a room with you before the end of my life. I hope so. And thank you so much for the work you do. Thank you
Thank you very
for
much.
being on the planet right now. Thank you, Mike, for doing this too.
Thank you. It's a pleasure meeting you, Bayo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoyed this episode of Waking Up Is Not Enough, Flourishing in the Human Space? Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode of insightful discussions and explorations into the human psyche. Share this episode with friends and family to spread the journey of self-awareness and critical thinking. Together, let's challenge the norms, embrace empathy, and flourish in our unique paths. Your support means the world to us and our growing community. Share your comments in the thoughts below. We love hearing from you.
The center will be offering a new foundational training in dialogue therapy at the Trapp Family Lodge in Stowe, Vermont. The new sessions are June 27th through 30th, then August 22nd through the 25th, October 31st through November 3rd. Please look at either my website or the Real Dialogue website. Click on to Foundational Training with Polly and have a look at the schedule. We will also be offering free trainings upcoming in various locations in Vermont, where we will be teaching the skill of real dialogue. So please join us, become a part of our community, and let us know that you enjoy what we're doing, and please contribute. We love to hear from you. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Please take a moment right now to go to realdialogue.com and join our membership community. For a short time, we're offering annual and lifetime membership in the Real Dialogue community at a very limited cost. There you have access to countless hours of teachings, interviews, conversations with Polly, Mike, and prominent scientists, sages, and seekers who share your interests in waking up and flourishing. Again, go to realdialogue.com, join in a live conversation with Polly and Mike through your membership. The second Tuesday of each month, we have an AMA that we do together. As always, we really look forward to meeting you and to hearing your perspective. Please like and share the podcast with friends and family. If you know of people who you think would benefit from this conversation and would like to take part in our monthly AMAs, consider sharing this with family and friends, and consider giving them the gift of membership in our community. This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Coltrane and is part of the Center for Real Dialogue. It is available on all major podcast channels for free. Thank you for listening.